We're live on Book Chat Live, and this week we have the amazing Kerry-Green on the show.
Hello.
So, hello, Carol, and welcome to the show. So, very briefly, tell people what kind of books you write and what kind of books you like reading.
Right. Well, I like writing any urban fantasy novels to do with vampires and other creatures, and I've also started writing paranormal romance recently. So but that one's more to do with magic and creatures from another dimension. As to reading, oh God, I've been reading science fiction and fantasy since I was knee high to a grasshopper, so to speak. I always say I grew up reading science fiction and fantasy, but I love a lot of historical books as well, and the classics and things like that. I mean, I've read so many different books.
Okay. Well, shall we go on to your first book choice then, which is a classic book? And your first book is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, which surprisingly has never been on the show before.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, it's always been one of my favorites. I read it, I think, when I was a very young, early teen. So probably a bit too early to appreciate some of the themes in the latter part of the book. But one of the things I always enjoyed was the first part of the book where Jane goes off to school, and she's in the school, and we get the nasty side of sort of these schools that were set up for charitable children before a sort of like really bad sort of like I think it's like a whooping cough, or it's something really bad that strikes the school and practically clears a lot of the, kills a lot of the children, and a lot of them are sent home, and then things change. One of the reasons that I really enjoyed this, I read a biography of Charlotte Bronte, and she had two older sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, who both died quite young. But they were sent to schools very similar to the one in Jane Eyre, and a lot of that is based on the lives of her sisters. And then, of course, Charlotte herself later on went on to become a governess, so she had quite a lot of experience of working in other people's houses and being that sort of genteel poverty, I think they used to call it. So it's always been a book I've enjoyed.
I had a phase where I started reading books like this as kind of feeling that I'd missed out on reading a lot of classic books. All I can really remember is that it had a really I think it has a fairly dark ending, doesn't it, if I recall?
The ending is that some of the themes towards the end of the book are quite dark, in that Jane Rochester, who's the main character, who she goes to teach his presumably illegitimate daughter Adele, and they fall in love, or she falls in love with him, and then she finds out that he's actually keeping his mad wife in the attic, which was at that time in history was fairly common, I have to say. If they had the money, they would get someone in to look after them rather than going somewhere like Bedlam, which was not a very nice place. But so she runs away. Obviously, then she has no money, no clothes. She's taken in by a charitable family, and then begins a new life. And it's only later on that she finds that her uncle on the Eyre side of the family has left her some money, and she goes back to find Rochester to see, and discovers that there was a fire. The mad woman in the attic set the house on fire, which killed her, but he was badly injured when he went to try and save her. So he's blind in one eye, and there's various other, so it's a bit dark in that, sort of they've got different themes of, sort of like she can always hear this like crying scream and wondering what it is and where it's coming from, and things like that. So it's very interesting.
I also remember it was a very good book, so I probably need to reread this at some point.
Yeah, I think I've read it. Well, one point I was reading it practically every year, but I think I'm down to about once every 2 or 3 years now.
Okay. Well, after making it and putting everybody off by saying it was dark, probably should
No, it's
answer
very
the next
good.
one.
It is
Yeah.
excellent. I mean, there's so many different things happening within it, and if you get a chance to watch it, the BBC did a series in the 80s, I think it was, with Timothy Dalton playing Mr. Rochester, and that's the best version I've seen of the TV series. Highly recommended.
Okay, let's go on to the next one. The Children of the New Forest by Frederick Marryat.
Yes.
So
Yeah. Children's book. Again, I read this when I was very young. It's takes place just after the end of the English Civil War. So it takes place about in the 1640s and 50s. And it deals with 4 young children, 2 girls, 2 boys, whose parents were Cavaliers. And they're sort of like whisked off to a sort of like a cottage in the New Forest, where they try and sort of live a different life to the one that they lived as sort of children of quite wealthy parents. And it talks about their sort of friendships with local Protestant children, and it like ends with the Charles II coming back in 1660 when he was restored to the throne, and them taking their rightful place, sort of thing. I mean, it is very much a child's view of the Roundheads and Cavaliers, but I must admit, it kind of like made me a Cavalier for a long time. Whereas, my own grown up thoughts probably would have put me on the Roundhead side of the Civil War, but yeah, it was, and it also was the basis for the very first short story I ever wrote.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I was very young, and I wrote a time travel story.
Yeah.
Where sort of like go back in time and find yourself, oh look, you're in the cottage of the Children of the New Forest. So it's had a big, sort of impact on my early writing career.
Yeah. I mean, it's. I suppose I would have always said that I was more the Roundhead side, but it's very hard because it was so long ago, and it was kind of the Roundhead thing is very obviously kind of what you would expect from a modern point of view, but at the time, it's like.
Yeah, I mean, civil wars are always difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, sort of choosing which side. I mean, I don't know if you know, but I live in Hull, in Yorkshire, and of course that was one of the places where Charles I tried to enter the city just at the beginning of the Civil War and was turned away, which many people say was actually the thing that caused it in the end. But so we've got a very proud tradition in this city of turning the Kings of England away, although we've pretty much stopped that now. But so I think it's a good way for children to learn about some of the conflicts and sort of things that were happening in history. I mean, I always think that fiction, if it's done well, can be a learning thing as well.
Yeah, no, that's tremendously true. Anyway, shall we go on to the next book?
Indeed.
Probably the total opposite of that in many ways. And here we go. June by Frank Herbert.
Yes.
So this is not about the Civil War.
No, definitely not. No. Oh yeah, June. What can you say about that? I mean, I'm sure there's lots of people out there who will have seen the recent film and the TV series. I think Sky did one a few years ago. I mean, it wasn't particularly brilliant, but I remember the one with Sting from many years ago, and but the book itself, I mean, it's just so big. It's like about yay big, and it's just so packed with really interesting, diverse discussions on space travel and the how that particular empire was run, and this idea of spice that's needed to move through space, and how sort of the Bene Gesserit, who are the sort of like semi sort of they're not witches as such, but it's that kind of like idea, and they're such a and influence on, particularly Paul, because his mother's becomes a one of their members, and Paul Atreides himself, who's like the main character, and it hits his life when he goes to June with his father and their whole, sort of like people to take over the mining of the planet, and as they learn what actually it means to to meet these massive worms that travel through the sand and create the spice, that makes the world go, well, makes the empire go around. It's certainly, I think I sort of like, I must have read it in the late 70s, early 80s, and it's just an amazing book. There are a few follow-ups to it, but I mean, Children of Dune, I think, is the one that comes after it. But I never thought any of the follow-ups came anywhere near the, spectacular sort of like of the first book.
Yeah. Well, it sounds, I mean, I haven't actually ever read the book, but it sounds from what I've heard that none of the adaptations have really done it justice.
No. I mean, I think it'd be very hard to do that.
Yeah.
It's one of those books where there's just so much going on. There's so much politics. There's so much, like, there's various different groups. There's the Fremen, there's the Bene Gesserit, there's the Emperor, there's, all the various houses. And, it's like, I think it'd be very difficult to, I mean, I haven't seen the film that came out, I think it was last year or earlier this year.
Yeah.
But my husband watched it and he said he thought it was, worked quite well. But I know they're doing part 2, I think, which is coming out this year. I suppose, like, splitting it into 2, maybe they thought they could cover more ground. So, but I mean, I'm more of a reading and a book person. I'm not always that that up for the films and the TV movies or whatever.
Well, I saw it. I saw the part 1, and it's pretty good. But apparently they've delayed part 2 because of the writers' strike in.
That's right. Yeah.
Strike. So, people have got time to read the book.
Got plenty of time to read the book before the next film comes out.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's go on to the next one, which is Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Now, this is not about Space Empire, so
no, it's just going back to the classics. And again, this is one of the books that I read for my O-level way back in the day when it was still an O-level and not the GCSE that it is now. But yeah, I mean, I think any Dickens books really, the Victorian era was such a diverse era in this country. And one of the things that Dickens does is he really digs deep into the poverty and into the lives that the ordinary people led. I mean, he himself didn't have a particularly very good early life. I mean, I don't know if you've either read or seen David Copperfield, but the early part of that book is mostly based on his own experiences. So he did have a very difficult upbringing, and he spent his latter years sort of later on when he was a young man, sort of writing in courts. He was doing court translation and stuff, and then he started writing his books, and they were published in newspapers. They were always published, I don't know if it was weekly or monthly, I can't remember. But Great Expectations, I mean, it's the story anybody would, sort of be plucked out of obscurity, given lots of money and sent to London, and sort of being, told, live your life sort of thing. And but of course, there's a lot more, to it than that. And you've got Magwitch, who was the convict who Pip helped, sort of in inverted commas, when he was a child. Who's actually, sort of responsible for his position later on, and the various relationships between the characters that he knew at home, and Miss Havisham was well known as being the bride that got left at the altar, and Estella, her sort of ward, I guess she is, and how she's brought up to be to be sort of like quite cruel really to men, sort of like which comes from Miss Havisham's own sort of experiences. And again, it's one of those books that doesn't have a particularly. I think it actually wrote two endings to it. One was where, sort of like at the end where Pip and Estella sort of like, it's quite a dark ending and they fall out and she goes off and everything like that. And the other one is like, where they get together at the end of the book and, sort of everything. But it's, I think one of the things about it is again, the detail that he went into. Particularly when Pip moves to London and he meets his friend Herbert, the life they lead, and his uncle who's the local blacksmith, and when he comes to visit them in London, and there's quite a comic bit when he's got this like top hat and he just doesn't know what to do with it, and he keeps trying to put it on the mantelpiece and it keeps falling off, and he's just embarrassed about it and just really not knowing what to do. It's those relationships. So again, it's one of the things he's very good at. And there's another. His solicitor is Jagger, and his clerk, whose name I can't remember now, but he lives with his father at home, and he calls him the aged P or the aged Pa. And he has various things that he likes to do, including setting off sort of various explosions and lowering the what do you call it, the portcullis sort of thing. I mean, not that he's got these things, but that's his life sort of thing. And Pip finds this absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. So why did you pick this book over? I mean, he's written quite a few.
He has. I think
it was,
I think it was this one or David Copperfield, really.
Yeah.
But having said that, then there's there's lots of others. But
Oliver Twist, great. Tale of Two Cities, and
Tale of Two Cities, Oliver Twist. Yeah, there's just so many of them. But I think because I did it at school, it was one of the first ones that I read. So I have reread it a few times since then, and I think I've just grown to like it more each time. Because when you're doing it at school and you're studying it for an exam, you don't always necessarily enjoy the books you're reading. So so I think going back and rereading it, as more of an adult in my 20s, it was got a different experience.
Okay, let's go on to the next book. Another classic, maybe. Oh, Blood and Shadows, right? Which is your book, obviously.
This is my book, yes. Yeah. So this is my the first book of my Donati Chronicles series.
Yeah.
And this is the story of Jerome Rossini. He's an American who lives in New York. As a teenager, his father, who is responsible for him being kidnapped and tortured, and Jerome manages to escape with the aid of his maternal cousins. And they find out that there's all sorts of shenanigans why his father was doing this. He wants Jerome's paranormal powers that Jerome doesn't even know he's got at that point. So he disappears and joins the army, gets invalided out after he and his friend were attacked and got blown up, sort of thing. His friend died. He goes back to New York, where he sort of like spends some time sleeping on the sofa of his friend's sister. But he's got PTSD, he's depressed, he's still got injuries, and he just crawls off into this alley one day, basically to just die, because he's had enough. When his maternal great-grandfather finds him, and this is Cornelius, who's one of my favorite characters, Cornelius Rossini, and he's an older Donati. He's been around since the 1700s. And his paranormal power is that he can stop time, which comes very handy. And his partner is Dastan, and his power is that he can read people's memories. so you can like rifle through their memories like a Rolodex sort of thing. Because Jerome's great grandmother died in the Paris Commune, and Cornelius never remarried, but he did meet Dastan during the First World War when they were both working behind the scenes as ambulance drivers and sort of things like that. So basically, they take Jerome on board. They sort of start patching him up, start explaining to him about his powers and what can happen. And then his father turns up again, and it all goes to hell in a handbasket sort of thing, So there's vampires who are good vampires, and then there's the Striga, who are what sort of many of us consider vampires to be, and they're working with his father and with some other sort of people to try and sort of bring the Donati down, to bring society down and everything like that. So yes, it's just basically a rollicking, sort of lots going on with explosions and stabbings and people dying and.
So what? This kind of sounds like a mix of urban fantasy and paranormal stuff. It's not a romance.
It is, yeah. I mean, there's paranormal with the various different powers and everything they have, but it's all set in New York and then Melbourne and Sydney in Australia, and then back to New York again. So it's mostly set in the cities.
Yeah.
And so at the end of book one, his father gets his comeuppance, but there are still other enemies that book 2 and book 3 will deal with. So it's
Have you written book 2 and 3 yet? Or?
I've written book 2. Book 2 is out, and book 3 I've got about 15,000 words of that one written. So that's where. So hopefully that'll be out next year with any luck.
Yeah. And right, people might see this next year. You don't know. Like,
well, you never know.
check the listing of this book, and I'm sure it'll be linked to all the others that are available. So at least if they like this book, they can read the next one afterwards. Now,
indeed,
hope, and depending how soon they see this, after 2023,
2024, the next one might be out.
Well, yeah, exactly. Okay, let's go on to the next book. Which is The Colour Purple.
Yes, I was to call this another classic.
Yeah.
Colour Purple by Alice Walker. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I read this one in it probably would have been late 80s, early 90s, and I absolutely loved the film.
Yeah.
I can't remember whether I saw the film first and then read the book, or whether it was the other way around. I think this is one of the exceptions to where I like the book and the film. Normally I tend to prefer the book to the film, but in this case I don't think you can really sort of pull them apart. The story is just it's just devastating in many respects, the way that characters are dealt with, their lives. Not only you've got to deal with the ever-present racism in the American South, but you've also then got to deal with sort of the problems at home, and sort of just basically trying to get a living. What happens to her sister when her sister is brother and sister are sold away from her. I'm trying to remember the name of the main character. It's out of my head at the moment. And the various things that happen to them, but how she then fights back.
Yeah.
And she starts her own business. She becomes her own person. She becomes a businesswoman, and she then, sort of. It's just there's just so much in it that sort of it's a powerful story of not only a woman, sort of gaining her own business, gaining her own independence, but of a Black woman who, in many parts of the South of America is still, sort of not the most free of all people. And I think it's just amazing. I've read other books by Alice Walker as well. Sort of Blue Eyes, I think, was one, and there's another one. But I think this one just blew my mind when I read it the first time.
Yeah, I've seen neither the film nor read the book, but I probably should do both. But why is it called The Color Purple? Is that a reference to the book? Or?
It's in the book, and that she becomes a seamstress.
Oh, okay.
She becomes, her sort of like main thing is making trousers for men and women that are, you know, sort of what's the word, unisex sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's, you know, sort of around the colour of the various materials and you know, sort of things like that. So, and also there's lots of references to the scenery and everything, and yeah, it's, you know, there's just different things in there.
Okay. Right. Shall we go on to the next book? Walk to the End of the World by Susie McKee Sharness.
Yes, yes. Now this one's this one is it was written in the 1970s, and it's a feminist dystopia. When I went to university, which I was a mature student, so I went when I was 30, I did literature, I did humanities, so basically literature, history, geography. But in literature, I had to do a dissertation. And I was, because I've been reading lots of science fiction, so I mean, I've been, you know, reading it for so long. And I read quite a lot of feminist science fiction in the 1970s, 80s, into the 90s. I don't know if you remember the Women's Press. It was a particular publisher, and all their books had like stripes on the cover and everything. And they particularly, you know, published feminist tellings and retellings and books by feminist authors. So this was where I was coming from reading this book. It's a dystopia. It's set several hundreds of years after there's been a sort of like, I think, nuclear war, and it's set in a place called the Holdfast, which is run by men, for men, and any women that are there, they're not called, they're just called femme, F-E-M, or femme. They're not treated very well. They're just there for, they're blamed for everything, and, you know, sort of, we've got to remember this is like a few hundred years in the future, so these things have had a chance to fester and become worse. And one of the main characters is Aldera, whose way out of being, you know, sort of part of this cycle is to learn how to run, and learn how to run well, which means that she gets used for messages. She gets sent different places to take messages, and, you know, and she's all the time looking as a way to get out. See, there's supposed to be this society of free women somewhere out there in the desert, and she's always looking to see if she can get there. And then she's sent on a trip with a few men to one of the other places near the Holdfast. There's not many places left, and they're on, you know, going out to see somebody who can maybe give them some information that the men will. It's something to do with the men don't know who their fathers are, but this one guy thinks that, you know, somebody does know who his father is, so he's trying to find it. It's quite a brutal story, really. I mean, she's not treated very well by them on the journey. The end of the book is that she does escape from them. She does find that there are free women out there, though they're not necessarily the group she was looking for. And she finds herself at the end that she's pregnant. And then it goes on. There's another couple of books afterwards that then deal with what happens at that time. But it was just one of the many books that I read at that time. Then it just I don't know, it was just something that spoke to me, that I thought, you know, this could be our society if things were left to fester, and you know, and just went that way. You know, I don't think that, you know, men would, you know, so I haven't got anything against men or anything like that, you know, but, you know, obviously when you're looking at, you know, science fiction in particular, you're looking at the idea of what if, and the question in this book is, what if this had happened? What would happen? How would we deal with it? how would the different sexes deal with it, you know, sort of what would happen, what societies would come out, and things like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the great, well, you say the great thing about science fiction is you can explore topics that maybe would be difficult to do
That's
in current world situations.
yes, yeah. I mean, you can explore topics that are uncomfortable.
Yeah.
You know, so and you know, gives you the opportunity to you know, to say, you know, if this happened, what would happen here.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the reasons why I've always liked science fiction and fantasy is that, you know, the whole idea is that it's like Dune, you know, well, what if you had this massive empire and it,
Yeah.
you know, it relied on this one thing that was only available from one planet to get from, you know, get from planet to planet. What would you do, sort of thing? So
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, well, let's go on to another classic work of literature. Which is Living in Shadows by
Kerry-Green.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is book 2 of the Donati Chronicles, and this, so like Living in Shadows, deals with Jerome's grandmother on his maternal side, who she has been living in shadows, living in the Shadowlands. Her husband arranged for her to be transported to this place called the Shadowlands, which is between our you know, in between the world. It's like, you know, the idea that you get people who walk around the back of a building and disappear wherever they're gone, you know, and often, so, you know, you've gone into the Shadowlands. And Jerome is only aware of this. Again, he's mostly the main character. He's only aware of this because she comes to him when he's a child, you know, sort of on the dream plane, sort of thing. So, and you know, he then forgets about it as he goes through all the trauma. But later on, he starts, after he's been, you know, taken in by his great grandfather, and they start investigating things. He starts getting, you know, this, you know, memories of her. And then his great uncle disappears, and Cornelius's brother Ignacio disappears, and he lives in Florence. And then they have to go to Florence to try and find out what's going on. And again, you've got, you know, so all the various Striga and everything, you know, trying to stop people. And Dastan himself gets thrown into the Shadowlands, and he's badly injured when he gets there. So time is not on their side. And Jerome has to start learning to use his powers to teleport. You know, something he didn't know that he could do. You know, so in order to be able to eventually manages to be able to teleport into the Shadowlands and rescue them. But it's the Shadow. It's great. They've been there a long time. I mean, she's been there about 50, 60 years. And the people that she's with, she like set up a small, she's like met a guy. God, I can't remember his name. It's dreadful. I can't remember the name of your own characters. But he was a Roman legionnaire, and he was from Britain in the Roman times, and he's been there ever since. And you know, they don't age, they don't die, they just live, and they could be there anything from a week to a year to, you know, hundreds of years. And so eventually it just managed to help them and get them back again. So that one's set in Florence, which was nice to write. I mean, I wish I could have gone to Florence, but unfortunately, so I had to put, you know, cope with watching lots of videos and TV programs and doing as much research as I could.
So is this the same series as the first book?
It is, yeah. The first one's called of Blood and Shadows. This one is Living in Shadows, and the third book, when it comes out, will be called Out of the Shadows. So I'm trying to have that theme.
So is there kind of like a through line in the story with all these?
Yeah, that's it. The through line is that there's someone who wants Jerome's powers, and they don't know who it is to begin with. They think it's his father, but it's not. He's just a dupe. I won't give away who it is because he's one of the sort of characters. But then they do find out in book 2 who it is, and then in book 3, they have to try and find a way of defeating him. And and that's book 3 is about that and other things that happen. And I haven't all quite got that in my head yet, but it's coming along.
Yeah. I mean, I always find the book 3 is the hardest one to write in some ways because you have to kind of tie all the bits together.
That's it. Yeah, tying all the ends up, and sort of getting the the nuance across, sort of thing is
Yeah. Okay, so let's go on to the next book. Aftermath by Cara D.
Yeah. I was going to say this is a fairly recent book, but actually, when I looked at it again this week, I think it was 2014. So it's not that recent. Only a few, 78. No, where are we now? 20. Yeah, almost 10 years ago. This is a book I've read it a couple of times. It's a story about a group of men who are one by one they're kidnapped by this guy. They don't know who he is. No idea what his name is, and he's gone to an awful lot of trouble. He's set up in this basement. He's set up 5 cells, and each cell holds 2 men. They're always handcuffed. We've got the handcuffed in front of the hands. There's no way out of the cells. There's nothing to use as any kind of weapon. They're fed once a day. They're given chicken soup to eat once a day. They're given clean water. And that's it. And he then sort of like turns up and gives them all this like assignment, and they've all got a different name to what their own name is. The main characters are Austin and Cam, and they're 2 of the guys in one of the cells, and it's about the way that they cope with this, and the way that they try to help each other. When one of them gets shot, they extract the bullet, sort of thing, and the guy who's holding them, who gradually comes to call Psycho, every now and again he'll take one of them upstairs and he'll torture them. He'll just basically torture them for whatever reason. Unfortunately, there's 10 men to begin with. One of them commits suicide fairly quickly, and then one is shot by Psycho. So then that he's his father, and you're going to get what you. And this poor guy's like only in his early 20s, sort of thing. So he's obviously got lots of mental problems. And then another one also later on commits suicide. So there's only 7 of them left. And Austin and Cam have this thing between them where gun or no gun. So basically, whenever he comes down, he's got this gun and he's holding it against them. And they get to the point where they're just past it. They've been there. Well, when they get out, they find out they've been there 5 months. But they've been there a long time. They don't really know how long. And, so they have to try and get out. And the book's told from the point of view from after they've got out and they've been reunited with their families, and they're trying to live their lives again. And then it's told, goes through flashbacks about what happened when they were captive. And it's the story of, really, it's a love story in the end, because Cam and Austin fall in love. As Austin says at one point, he can't imagine. He doesn't like not being there with him every day, because he's always been there every day. He's been looked after him. They've looked after each other with illness or when they've been well. And Cameron's on the autistic scale. He's got the Asperger's, sorry. So he has his own problems. So it's like this different story between what's happening to them in the world once they've returned to it and how they're coping. Obviously, they've got PTSD, they've all got problems, and what happened whilst they were in the cells. And so it's quite, I found it quite powerful.
Yeah.
I haven't read any of her other books, though I understand she's written quite a few, but that one just really, I think the story just drew me in.
Yeah, it sounds quite interesting as a concept, because like going flashback kind of media can be quite interesting.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, sometimes, they'll have flashback, something can set them off and they'll remember, something that happened, like, one of them getting shot, or, when they were ill, they'll have, this sickness, and, when one of them, first one committed suicide, and then when the other guy shot the one in the cell, he just left his body there for weeks. And his body was just gradually decomposing in this cell. How do you cope with that sort of thing? So yes, it's like that psychological, sort of thing about when you're a prisoner and then when you're not.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go on to the next book. We get too much into the world of decomposing bodies.
Yes.
The Merlin trilogy by Mary Stewart.
Yes.
And I've got the book Crystal Cave, which I think is the first one.
Yeah, that's it. Crystal Cave, The Last Enchantment. Crystal Cave, Hollow Hills, and The Last Enchantment.
Yeah.
They were written in the early 1970s. I mean, I love Mary Stewart's books anyway. She wrote a lot of sort of like pseudo adventure romance books in the 60s and 70s, and I loved them, reading them when I was growing up. But to me, this Merlin one is one of the best tellings of the Arthurian legend in fiction.
Yeah.
And because it comes at it from Merlin's point of view. It follows him right through from when he was a child, growing up in Wales. His, sort of learning from his teacher who lives in a cave, the hollow, the Hollow Hill. Finding out that he can foresee things, he can see what's going to happen in the future, and then sort of finding out about sort of Uther Pendragon and Arthur, and how he, in the second book, he's like more keeping track of Arthur as he's growing up. He's in Brittany, but he's Merlin himself goes off to Africa, I think, if I remember rightly. Goes off on his travels, but he can still, sort of when he dreams, he can still see Arthur as a child and what's happening to him. And then he arranges for him to be adopted by I can't remember his name now, but and Kai is his foster brother. And then he returns and finds himself a nice cave, settles in as a hermit, and then when the boys turn up, sort of starts befriending them and then teaching them, and teaching Arthur basically what he's going to know to become king. So yeah, it's a brilliant, sort of series. If you like the Arthurian legend, there's some really interesting things in there.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say most people like the Arthurian legends, but I think it's pretty popular. So
yeah, I mean, it is. It's it's very. I don't know. I think it's one of those very British things.
Yeah, it's definitely British, but then again, it's like Americans like a lot of the British stuff. So
indeed.
As well. Okay, let's go on to the next book. The Motion of Light in Water by Samuel R. Delany.
Yes, Samuel Delany, a science fiction author from the sort of like late 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s onwards. Also known as Chip Delany. And The Motion of Light in Water is it's an autobiography, and it tells the story of him growing up in New York. He got married very early on, and he was only 19, I think, and his wife wasn't that much older than him. I mean, he's a writer, and she becomes a poet. Later on, Marilyn Hacker. She, and also a very good poet, I might add.
Yeah.
But Delany is gay, and is black and gay, and it tells about his life in New York at the sort of like the late 60s, early 70s, and it's very much a time before AIDS.
Yeah.
He tells about going cruising in Central Park in New York, sort of just encounters that he has with other gay men that, today they probably wouldn't even consider because of the possibility of AIDS and what happened in the 80s and everything. But it's also a story about him learning about his writing, about writing science fiction and growing. They were very young when they got married and they sort of like grew up together. Then I think they were together in the end for about 19, 20 years. But obviously, she knew he was gay and then he knew she was a lesbian sort of thing. But they still had one daughter together. So they, and it's just a beautiful book about a time that can never be recaptured. For young gay men in New York. And also, of course, with being black, there's also that, that issue as well. And for a long time, Samuel Delany was one of the only black authors for science fiction. It's only really been in the last 20, maybe 30 years at most. I mean, there were three. There was Samuel Delany, Octavia Butler, and Stephen Barnes, up until about the 2000s. And then since then, you've got a lot of Afrofuturism authors coming in, and obviously things have begun to change quite a lot since then. But for a long time in the science fiction world, that was it. It's a beautiful book, and it's an autobiography. It tells his life and how he got into writing at a young age, and he then became a professor of literature later on. He was he's in his 80s now, but but he worked at a particular university for a long time. And so I'd recommend it to anyone who's got any interest in sort of authors and in that sort of area.
Well, sometimes you get a book that just gives you a sort of slice of history, doesn't it? It's like
it's very much in a way, because it's very much a slice of life. And it's a slice of life that as a white middle-aged woman, when I read it, I didn't have any clue about. I knew him as an author. I've read his books. I've loved his books. There's lots of his novels I've read and enjoyed. I even met him once, but sort of, a science fiction convention, not really. More of a like, hello, pleased to meet you sort of thing. But it's a totally different life to mine. So
Okay, let's go on to the next book. The Bridge by Ian Banks.
Yes. Another one of Ian's amazing novels. Ian Banks, or Ian M. Banks, when he wrote his science fiction novels. But whichever, with or without the M, he was an absolutely brilliant author. And I chose The Bridge of his because of the way that he designs the mechanics of the bridge. Basically, what it is the main character is driving home and is looking at the bridge of the Firth of Forth, and is not really quite paying attention, and he has a car crash and ends up in a coma. But whilst he's in the coma, he's in this other world of the bridge where you've got lots of in some respects now I think people will probably say there's a bit of steampunk in there, but only in as much as the way that some of the things work in the elevators going up and down and some of the walkways, and it's all very metallic and things like that. And it just deals with is he in this world? Is this a real world? Are we in a fantasy world here? Or is it a dream? Is he in this coma? Who is he? It's one of those that just asks so many questions, and it's one of his. I think it's one of his best anyway. And I've read nearly all of his. But
So this was the one that it was like the one you recommended. So
that's it. If you're gonna, a lot of people recommend or say about the Wasp Factory, which was his perhaps most famous one. I didn't read that for quite a long time. because I've been put off it by people saying it was quite horrific, and it was when I got around to reading it. But when I did get around to reading it, I really, I enjoyed it. So you can enjoy, and I've always liked his science fiction. I mean, he's no longer with us now, but he was. He did used to turn up at science fiction conventions when I used to go to them, and I always liked his, his science fiction books, his massive sort of like novels, quite thick, sort of had massive spaceships and all sorts in his science fiction books. But his non-science fiction was also, there was always something a little different about it.
Yeah.
Yes, it was never just like a straightforward book.
Yeah, well, I think this is the only book of his that's been recommended on the show before, actually.
All right,
check that out. Actually, saying that, I've got Ian Banks and Ian M. Banks and different little things.
Yeah, I mean, Ian M. Banks and Ian Banks is basically the same.
Yeah, person. I think this is the only of his Ian Banks ones.
Yeah.
I need to check though. So
yeah,
talking baloney. So anyway, let's go on to the next book. Kindred by Octavia Butler, who you've already mentioned.
Yes, that's right. Octavia Butler. Yes, she was an African American author. Unfortunately, she died about 20 years ago. She was only fairly young. She was only in her 50s. But she wrote sort of several books, and Kindred is one of my favourites. It's one that it deals with a young lady called Dana, who's an author, and she wrote it in the mid-70s, I think. And Dana is married to, she has a white husband, so she's black and her husband's white, and they've just moved into the new house when Dana feels dizzy, and she finds herself on the banks of a river, and there's this red-headed young boy in the river drowning. So what does she do? As you would, you jump into the river and you save him. But then this keeps happening. Next time she goes back in time again, and it's the same young boy who's slightly older now, and he's in a fire, and she has to say, so she saves him. And but of course, what the place she's going back to is Maryland, and it's in the time of the slavery, and he's the son of the plantation owner. And when she's there, she's just seen as being a slave, and that's it. And so she stays for various lengths of time, sometimes only a few minutes, sometimes it's a week. At one point, I think, she's there for a few months. So, and she gets to know the other slaves on the plantation, hello, Mary, especially, the women.
Yeah.
And then she knows from speaking to her grandmother and everything back home that the woman who she's getting to know is actually her own ancestor, great grandmother, whatever.
Yeah.
And so every time she's drawn back, it's always for some reason. And the boy's called Rufus, but she goes back and he's growing up gradually till he becomes a man. One of the times when she goes back, her husband is pulled back with her. But unfortunately, when she returns, he's not there, and he's stuck in the past.
Yeah.
I think he's there for at least a year, maybe 2 years, until the next time she goes, and then they go back together. But the actual is that the young boy she keeps saving, or the young man, is Rufus, who actually turns out to be her great-great-great-grandfather sort of thing.
Yeah.
And he's in a relationship, or not relationship, with one of the slave women. So it's quite a difficult book to read from that point of view. But I mean, all of Butler's books deal with the issues around slavery and about being black. They're all, I mean, Kindred's the only one where it's like, sort of where backwards and forwards in time travel and everything. Most of the others are set in the future, far future. But yeah, I sort of highly recommend it.
Okay.
It's always been one of my favourites.
It sounds like it doesn't dodge the difficult issues, so to speak.
No, definitely not. No, no. It deals with them face on, head on.
Yeah. Okay. And let's go on the final classic. book we have. Lady Emma's Diaries by Kerry-Green. I think you've actually somewhere you've got another name in there as well, but this is your book name. So
yeah,
this is romance, isn't it?
this is yes, it's paranormal romance.
Yeah.
And despite it having Lady Emma on the front, the main character is actually Polly, who's Lady Emma's great granddaughter. If I remember rightly. Basically, what it is that Polly discovers that she's the inheritor of an ability, magic ability, that's passed down from woman to woman through the family. But every 150 years, a gateway between dimensions opens, and this chimera comes through and starts to try and destroy things. Polly lives in a stately home, which is a fictional stately home, I hasten to add. And I've set it in Leconfield, which is not far away from where I live. But it's based on lots of different stately homes in this area. And the reason why this is called Lady Emma's Diaries is because Lady Emma left lots of journals, diaries, and letters to Polly to explain what was happening and to, let her know what was going on. Now, when Polly was 11 years old, she got this mark on her wrist. It's not, not a tattoo. It's not, nobody did it. It just appeared. And then one night the alarms go off and she goes down to the library, and there's these two young men there, and they're looking for a magical book. They've, broken in, sort of thing. But before she calls the police, or has a chance to call the police, realizes that they've also got this mark on their wrist. And then this connection begins between them. It's like this bond between them that draws them all close together. And the romance is it's how to put it, at the end Polly will end up with 6 lovers, put it that way.
Oh, okay. So like, if people don't like one of the people she's lined up with, there's another one.
It's a polyamorous, so it's like, a poly relationship. And they're all gathered together, and they're called the Coterie. It's called the Coterie Book 1, and basically it's their job to learn how to use magic to fight against this creature when it comes through. It breaks through a couple of times in this book. They manage to fight it off, but that's only like a beginning. Its real breakthrough will come later on, sort of the following year, and that's in book 2, which I'm writing now at the moment, which I've very nearly finished. I've only got about 7,000 or 8,000 words to go now. So and that's due out beginning of December, and so hopefully if I can get it finished and get it all sorted, it'll be out on the beginning of December. So yes, I mean it's a different thing for me. It's I wasn't really quite sure if I could write romance or not, but I just, the idea just came to me, and so I ran with it. So we'll see. Get book 2 finished, and you never know where you might end up.
So is that how are you juggling urban fantasy and romance then? Because you've kind of got 2 series on the go, though it sounds like the urban fantasy kind of one with your powers is finishing up with the next book. But like, have you switched over to romance now, or are you going to go back to urban fantasy? How's that work?
I'm not quite sure, because I do have an idea for some paranormal romance or romance book set in York. I lived in York for a few years, and I know this city quite well. And I've got an idea for about maybe 6 or 7 books of it worked out, all set around this courtyard of shops. But whether it'll be normal romance, paranormal romance, or mixture, I haven't quite decided yet.
It's going to be polyamorous.
It's still in the thinking stage. I haven't even started putting anything down on paper yet. So So I want to get this one and the third Denati book finished before I start on anything new.
Okay, so I always ask everybody like this question: if you had to pick one of these books to give somebody, which book would you give them?
Oh,
And I always put a caveat because it is a difficult question. So if you don't know off the top of your head, what kind of questions would you ask somebody to work out which book they would be best for them, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you want to know what kind of books they already read. I mean, because not everybody reads, that's the thing,
Yeah.
and not everybody reads genre books. I tend to read a lot of genre. I mean, I love crime as well, which I haven't even touched on here. But I think of all those ones that I've talked about tonight, I don't know, I think it would probably have to be June.
Yeah.
Just because of the breadth and width of the book itself.
I mean,
Very much there.
I suppose. Well, I mean, I like science fiction, and I've written time travel books, but I have been put off by the size of some of the enormous sci-fi books, and the same with some of the fantasy books.
Oh God, some of the fantasy doorstoppers, you mean?
Yeah. So I mean, this is where I'm like, something like Jane Eyre might be good for somebody who doesn't really read.
Yeah, I mean, if someone's into the classics, or if they're not quite sure, or the last book they read was in school, or I mean, Jane Eyre is quite good because of you build into it. You have the the build up into different things, and you've got the different different areas of her life. It's sort of almost a book in 4 parts, I guess. There's a bit where she lives with her aunt, and this bit when she's at school, then when she's a governess, and then the last bit when she's a school teacher, and then she learns that she's inherited this money, and so it's there's lots there for anyone to dig into, really.
And if you had to recommend one of your own books for somebody to start with, which one would you?
Of Blood and Shadows, I think, would be the first one to go for. Yeah, the Marty Chronicles. Start with Jerome, who's sort of he's the first book. First book Diana. This is Mary, by the way. So hello, Mary.
Hello, Cat.
I mean, I stopped writing for over 20 years, and then when I came back to writing, we got the self-publishing phenomenon had grown so much. So things have changed so much from the days when it was all just traditional publishers. So I think that's why Jerome's special to me, because it's the first book I've written in this new venture. So because prior to that, I'd written lots of science fiction stories and one novel, but not actually had anything published. So
So are you going to go? Have you still got those novels, or are you going to self-publish them, or are you just going to like moving on?
No, that's
the clean slate.
Put it away over there. I've still got some of the short stories, and one of those has been published in an anthology. But no, they're just like that's back there. Yeah. So,
well, it's like I've got a screenplay that I wrote, but I never did anything with it. So I could take that and make it into a novel too.
Yeah, turn it into a novel instead of a screenplay.
I mean, unfortunately, films are not. They're getting there, but they're not quite at the point where you can really self-publish films easily.
No. Things are moving on differently.
Yeah.
But I think self-publishing has made such a big difference for for authors, and sort of like being in my 60s now, it's just nice to be able to have a book there and say that this is what I've wanted to do since I was a teenager, and sort of, and hopefully there'll be a few more to come in the next few years.
Yeah. Okay, so let me end the Amazon side of things before we send anybody anywhere else. But how can people find out about you and get to know more about your books and other things?
Yeah, I'm on Facebook. I have a Facebook group called Carol's Worlds of Books, and a Facebook page under Carol Kerry-Green Books, and I have a website which is under Carol. If you just search for Carol Kerry-Green, it'll come up. I mean, I think I'm the only Carol Kerry-Green there is, so it'll either come up as the writing side or the genealogy side. So just choose whichever one you want.
Yeah, because you do genealogy as well, don't you? That's the.
I do. Yeah, I've been a
Yeah.
professional genealogist for 12 years now.
Oh, okay. So, have you got any specialisation, or do you just like somebody gets in touch with you and said, "I want to know about my family tree," and you?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much do almost anything. I tend to specialise more in the Yorkshire area because that's where
Oh, okay.
I'm from, and local archives are easier to get. But I do Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Lancashire. But it's pretty much if anyone said I want to trace my family history, then yeah, I'll give it a go.
Yeah,
Although I am hoping to move more towards the writing side than the genealogy side. But having done this for 12 years now, it's time to move on.
So, is there a lot of sort of going around churches and stuff and looking at like?
Oh yes, going around their churchyards, graveyards. Yeah.
Okay.
I usually say to my husband, right, you go over that way and look, and I'll go over this way and look. And, and if we find anything, we'll take photos.
Okay. Well, it's been great to talk to you. It's actually been the longest interview I've done in a while. So,
oh wow, okay.
yeah. So clearly it went well, and
Good.
thanks for everybody watching on YouTube. So,
okay, thank you.